Hello and welcome. My name's Ben Judah. I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council in Washington, DC, and welcome to our event today. I'm delighted to be joined by a really exceptional panel today to discuss what are the structural weaknesses to Europe and the West that have been exposed by Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine, as far as corruption and reliance on the hydrocarbon economy is concerned. I'm joined by Senator Bernie Sanders, US Senator for Vermont and a former US presidential candidate. Thank you so much for being here, Senator Sanders. I'm joined by David Lammy, MP, also from the United Kingdom, like me, UK Shadow Secretary for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs. Thank you for joining. And I'm joined by Dalara Burkhart, MEP in Brussels, who is a member of the Environmental Committee of the European Parliament. Thank you so much for joining here today. So here's how we're going to structure the event. I'm going to turn to each of you in turn. You'll speak for a few minutes. I'll ask a question, then our audience will ask a question, and then we'll pass to a moderated conversation. So Senator Sanders, welcome to the Atlantic Council.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And it's a pleasure to be here with our fellow panelists. I think it goes without saying that what we are seeing in Ukraine today is a horror that almost embarrasses all of us as being part of the human race, to see a large country just simply systematically destroy the people of a small democratic nation. But what is happening today in the Ukraine is more than just a human disaster in that country. What it speaks to is the role that oligarchy plays in the world, that in Russia, you have a handful of billionaires, including Putin, one of the wealthiest people in the world, running a country in which a tiny number of people own more income and wealth than everybody else in that country. You are seeing in this tragedy that at a time when we need the global community to come closer and closer together to deal with pandemics that are existing right now and will in the future, to deal with climate change, now you're going to see a return to the Cold War mentality. You're going to have Russia over there, China over there, United States, in Europe, and not having the kind of international cooperation that we need. If there is any silver lining, and I don't know that there is in this tragedy, is that I hope people throughout the world understand the need for working people, for progressives to bring the global community together around an anti-oligarchic vision, around a vision that says that we need economies in this world that work for all of us, not just a few. It's not just Russia. It's not just the United States. It's the Middle East. The statistics assembled by Oxfam and others are unbelievable. You got a handful of billionaires owning more wealth than 40% of the world's population. You got tens of billions of dollars of taxes being evaded by large corporations that dump their money in the Cayman Islands and other tax havens. So the struggle is becoming apparent, I think, to all people in this world. The fight is creating an economy that works for all, taking on the oligarchs. The struggle is to come together to address the existential threat of climate change. The struggle is to come together to deal with this pandemic and future pandemics. So that is the silver lining, that I think what Putin has done is exposed the entire world to the reality of disgraceful, outrageous, oligarchic behavior.
I'd like to ask you one question before taking one from the audience, which is, the Kremlin is a major dominant oil and gas supplier to Europe. What should we do about that? Does this mean we need to accelerate decarbonization?
Absolutely. Look, this is what you're looking at. If the climate crisis is not bad enough, and as everybody knows, you have scientists telling us we have a handful of years, small number of years, to transform our energy system. If that's not bad enough, what this crisis has told us is that we have to stand up to the oligarchs in Russia, in the Middle East, authoritarian types of incredible wealth who are producing a product that is destroying the entire planet. So of course, we've got to accelerate our effort to move away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energy. That goes without saying.
So I've got one question from the audience coming in here, which is, what should normal Americans be doing at home in order to deal with this problem?
Well, I think the immediate concern is that all of us rally against the outrageous behavior of Russia, that we do everything that we can to defend Ukraine. And I want to say just two things on this. I think all of us are deeply moved by the incredible courage of the Ukrainian people in standing up to the military machine of Putin. And second of all, and this does not get enough attention, I think, the incredible bravery of people in Russia who have gone out onto the streets, understanding that what will happen to them, God only knows. As you know, Putin yesterday was calling these people traitors. Well, when a dictator calls you a traitor, that is a very serious concern. We don't know what will happen to these people. So I think our goal in America now is to stand up against autocracy and oligarchy, to fight for democracy in our own country. It is no great secret that there is a movement led by Trump in an authoritarian direction. We've got to fight to revitalize democracy as a nation. We have got to come together against our own oligarchs. We have got to bring our people together to understand that we can create millions of good jobs, transforming our energy system. So those are some of the things that we've got to do in our own United States.
Thank you so much, Senator Sanders. I'd like to cross the Atlantic to Britain. David Lammy, MP, UK Shadow Secretary for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, and it's wonderful to be with you. I want to first agree with everything that Senator Bernie Sanders has said, and not repeat that, but add the following. Why has Vladimir Putin picked this moment? He's picked this moment because he looks around the world and he sees a project that's coming to its natural conclusion. One of the aims of his project has been to undermine democracies, certainly neighboring democracies, but we've also seen interference in the US democracy and in the UK democracy, which means that there's something about us defeating that interference, that cyber war, that propaganda war, and that effort to undermine our own democracies. He's also been part of an exodus of people from places like Syria, the Horn of Africa, into Europe, creating debates about immigration, particularly, and refugees. And we have seen a growth in a sort of populist right-wing movement here in Europe. And of course, in other parts of the world, under Trump, we saw a different rhetoric in relation to those coming from neighboring Mexico. We have to be generous in this moment to refugees, and we have to offer humanitarian assistance, of course, to Ukraine. There's another challenge to democracy, and that's been the short-termism and the complacency that I think that we've seen. He's picked this moment because he knows that America's coming up to the midterms. He sees Trump potentially coming back. He sees the problems that Boris Johnson's had in our own country, Macron facing an election, and Schulz effectively new in Germany. We have to be united across the developed and Western world, those that want to maintain democratic values, democratic norms, our liberal values that we cherish and hold dear. But we have to look beyond an election cycle. Because the complacency that we felt in the last period has undermined our attempts to deal with what in the end is a kind of ethnocentric imperialism. And I know what that is because my ancestors basically had a gun to their head and were enslaved people. And that's effectively what Putin is doing to the people of Ukraine. Of course, we've got to get away from our dependency on dirty fuel. That will be different for many European countries that have been over-dependent on Russian oil and Russian gas, different to the United States, of course. That's going to need a lot of international cooperation. Many of those countries that have high dependency in Europe will need support from America. There's a lot of solidarity now that has got to stretch across the Atlantic and to the east as well. And of course, we've got to see at the same time dealing with this issue of dirty money. And this is to go back to what Bernie Sanders has said. And this is not just an indulgence with Russian dirty money. In fact, dictators and despots from all around the world have been washing their dirty money in London, in overseas territories, which have murky rules around governance and around regulation of finances. We've had leak after leak, exposure after exposure. Nothing has effectively been done to deal with these shell companies, to deal with the dirty money. This is now time to clean up our act, because in the end, this is how the war has been being funded. So deal with refugees, deal with our dependency on dirty fuels, deal with dirty money. And of course, and this is a challenge for progressives, be absolutely clear in supporting Ukraine to defend itself with arms and with the best technology and equipment so that they can continue to wage this fight. And it is a fight, not just on their behalf, it's a fight on behalf of democracy itself.
Thank you. Question from me. How should Britain be reaching out to our allies in Europe and the European Union to deal with the challenge of refugees and the challenges of Putin?
Look, I do think that we have to be absolutely engaged with our European allies and partners. Clearly, exiting the European Union prevented obstacles. We've got to overcome those obstacles. And those obstacles now are not so much about the economic relationship that was at the center of the debate that was Brexit. It's absolutely about the security, diplomatic, and political relationship with our European allies. The change that has happened from Germany is immense. Countries like Sweden now and Belgium assisting Ukraine with arms. Britain needs to meet that challenge, and therefore we may well need a new architecture to ensure that there is better security across Europe going forward, that's obviously aligned and sits alongside the NATO arrangement.
I've got one question here coming in from the audience. Is it for real Britain's clampdown on the oligarchs, or are there still too many loopholes there?
Oh, this is just the beginning. We haven't reformed our company's house. There are many oligarchs that you can't get behind the opaque nature of the companies that they've set up to hide their money. There are oligarchs using family members to hide their money. We aren't clamping down at the moment on them. And what's happening in the overseas territories, what's happening in places which have very different financial regulation, but effectively are in the auspices of the United Kingdom. I'm afraid there's lots more to do. And as I say, it goes beyond just Russia. There are other parts of the world, I don't need to name check the countries, but you all know who they are, where we have to get off that. And watching Boris Johnson go to Saudi Arabia just a day after they executed 81 people begging effectively for oil is an indication of how much we still have to do.
Thank you so much. I'd like to go to Brussels now, to Dalara Burkhart, MEP, who is a member of the Committee of the European Parliament on Environmental Matters. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you for David and Bernie already touching on the points that I wanted to mention. And this is a good start, I think, because we see that progressives transatlantically combine in the struggles we now have to tackle. But let me take you maybe to the February 24th for my personal impression, being the youngest German MEP and growing up in the certainty that there's peace in Europe, or at least not having remembrance of when there was another time. So I was waking up in the morning of 24th, checking my phone and seeing the news alert, Putin invades Ukraine. And I was seeing in my WhatsApp groups where Ukrainian friends were telling me that they are now in subway stations seeking shelter from bombs coming. There were friends trying to manage somehow to get out of the country. And it really, the reality of war kicked in for a whole generation in Europe. And this is why I think what we have to address in a setting like this is that it's very good that the reaction until now between the US and the Europe, they have been united. We have been united in the approach in doing the sanctions, in supporting the Ukrainian people with humanitarian and military aid. And we have been also united when it comes now to taking the refugees within Europe. I think this is an important sign. But acting on a short note as well shouldn't mean that we should act short-sighted. So I'm really grateful for now touching on the structural debates, because we know, and this is what David and Bernie already said, crises often lay bare the flaws in our systems. The Russian aggression on Ukraine brutally laid open how the industrialized world thirst for fossil fuels and other raw materials built the foundations for an autocratic ruling. And it is, in fact, a system, and this also has been said, it's a system that enriches the few. And what I see, and I want to tell this as a lawmaker, seeing it right now, I'm working on the Green Deal, and I see that something is kicking in that the author Naomi Klein is calling disaster capitalism. We see the shock waves of the war in Ukraine are now used by the industrial lobby to revoke regulation, pushing their interests on the expense of nature and people. And this is exactly what we as progressives have to do. We have to expose those strategies. And we as the West, and this is what unites us too, have been beneficiaries of the system. And we will also have to pay a price to change it. And I think it's, again, the progressive jobs to now make sure that not only those pay who always are at the end of the line, but those who committed or who pushed this situation to escalate. So touching on the points, and I'm really looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much. So one question from me, which is, how can we accelerate decarbonisation in Europe? What exactly would that look like if we were going to really push a crash program on that over the next few years?
I mean, we have the Green Deal now, and right now we are in the middle of negotiating the so-called Fit for 55 package, which is a huge package that really goes through all sectors that are putting up emissions. So we have to push this legislative act to happen. And this is what is right now at risk. I mean, there is a big ambitiousness within the all European member states that we now have to make the Green Deal happen, that there needs to be an independence of fossil fuels to protect also European sovereignty. But I think what is important now is to not only push this decarbonization campaigns, but really also, as David was saying, to put it in a holistic concept of climate policies that grant also security to all people, because this is the risk I really see happening, that Putin wants Europe to be divided. Putin wants the West to be divided, and he wants us to be dependent. And this is why he's financing right-wing parties who are the same people who are climate deniers. So we have to watch out that our answer is embedded in a holistic approach, not to make more room for right-wing climate deniers to stop this decarbonization.
I've got one question for you from the chat, which is, what would it take for Germany to go for an oil and gas embargo, which would of course be extremely difficult on Russia?
I mean, it's on the table. It's on the table like every section we can consider. But I think it's good that our government decides to balance out when the right moment is to take this step. Because we see the risk that it's with it, because if we put it too early, there's a risk that you have to also have it on very long. And what will the social effect of that be? And is there a way exit out? So I think it's important that's on the table, and it's a possibility we have to use. But we have to also make sure that the sanctions we take don't hurt us more than they use in the situation. So I think it's good to balance it out, but I think it should be on the table.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to kind of open up the debate. If you're sort of logged in, please send a question via the Q&A function in the chat, and then I will pose your question on your behalf to the panelists. But before that, I'd love to know if our panelists would like to ask each other a question or share some thoughts about the current situation. So in that case, I'm going to jump right to the questions here. Here's one from the audience for Senator Sanders. Why is the United States doing so little about refugees?
I think that will change. I think there is widespread support in this country to bring in very, very large numbers of refugees from the Ukraine. I think people are aware, what we are seeing on TV, the destruction, the displacement of people, the fact there are now 3 million refugees has touched the heart of the American people. Now, some out there may ask a very legitimate question. How does it happen that there is so much sympathy for the Ukrainians, not quite so much sympathy in America for people of other colors? That's a legitimate question. But at this moment, at least, I think you will see from the Biden administration a significant effort to bring in as many refugees as we can.
So I've got another question coming in, really to everyone on the panel. What should happen if the Kremlin uses chemical weapons, as many fear, in Ukraine? What should the response be?
Well, look, the use of chemical weapons, even in matters of war, there are international obligations and rules. What we've seen are these false flags and this false propaganda that Ukraine may use chemical weapons. And unfortunately, that's because it's very likely that Russia itself is considering the use of chemical weapons. And we know that those chemical weapons have been used in Syria. And in fact, let's be clear, chemical weapons were used in the UK because the Salisbury poisonings effectively were the use of chemical weapons on UK soil and could have led to mass death in the city of Salisbury. We've got to be very clear that what Putin wants is an escalation. He wants to draw the international community into this crisis. So it's not just a war with Ukraine. It's a war in which he can maintain his reasoning, which is that this is because of NATO and NATO expansion. And we have to be very, very careful not to play into that narrative. And so we have to assist Ukrainians with both anti-tank weaponry and anti-air weaponry. But the clear international view across NATO countries, and I think Jens Stoltenberg is right, we cannot send NATO troops into Ukraine to fight alongside the Ukrainians. That makes this heartrending, and we have to maintain that this aggression starts and ends with Putin, and that's why there's more to do, I think, on sanctions. We have to literally cut, at this moment in time, Russia out of the economy that the rest of us are part of if we're serious about putting a squeeze on his war machine. But we cannot commit troops and we cannot commit air power.
And the impossibly difficult tightrope that all of our countries are walking is, on one hand, understanding that if he uses chemical weapons, he has also talked about nuclear weapons. So we're in a situation where obviously we want to prevent a World War III, but at the same time, the word has got to get out to Putin that there are limits, and that if he uses chemical weapons, he will be, and his economy will be completely isolated from the rest of the world. So I think, to answer your question, there is no magical solution but we simply have got to intensify our efforts to punish Mr. Putin and to make it clear that the use of chemical weapons is absolutely unacceptable.
I've got some hard questions coming in. So the first tough question I'd like to put to Brussels, to Dalara. Will Germany finally accept it needs to use nuclear power and extend the lifespan of its nuclear power plants because of this crisis? And just for background for some of our audience members, there's been a sort of long-standing opposition and a policy of decommissioning of nuclear plants in Germany, particularly from the left and from the green movements. A tough question.
Well, it's not a tough question for me because I cannot get why having another dependency on a raw material based energy will solve our situation. So I don't think nuclear energy is a solution for it. It's too expensive. It's too slow to deploy. We haven't yet still figured out how to store the toxic radiating waste, and it's a uncontrollable high-risk technology with a huge disaster potential. And when this disaster strikes, it's usually the most vulnerable people who are affected. And we have seen this in all crises, we have seen that. So I don't think that nuclear energy is a progressive solution in that sense. And I'm pretty sure that my country won't go back to using nuclear power. And I'm also really much advocating for us as Europeans not to declare fossil-based fuels, but also nuclear as sustainable, because they are not. And I'm talking about dependencies. It doesn't sound much, but 1/5 of the uranium we are using in Europe to power nuclear plants, it's coming from Russia. Only less than 1% of uranium is coming from Europe. So please let us discuss about what is really the solution. And it's solar power and it's wind energy. And this is the way to go.
Thank you. So I know that Senator Sanders needs to leave on the hour. So I just wanted to kind of thank him on behalf of the Atlantic Council for having joined us today and shared his thoughts.
Well, Ben, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be with Dalara. And okay, see you.
And I've got a tough question for you, David, in London, which is, on the 4th of February, Russia and China announced systemic competition where they would shore up oligarchic totalitarianism. Why so many on the left in Britain, USA, Europe, blaming NATO for the crisis?
Well, look, I don't think, I think there's so many on the left needs some challenge. I think we need to just step back from the knee-jerk America and its allies are always wrong and others are right. We also need to, I think, notwithstanding the issues that the invasion of Iraq particularly raised, we need to see this moment for what it genuinely is. I think that starts with the creation of NATO itself, and the British Labour Party must stand proud that it was, if you like, the midwife of NATO. Ernest Bevin and that Attlee government after the Second World War, recognizing that to maintain peace in Europe, we needed a defensive alliance so that you could never get what came out of Germany and Hitler again. And largely, I think that defensive alliance that obviously brought in our friends in the United States and in Canada, and now is 30 countries large, has maintained the peace. The key is it's a defensive alliance, and it's an alliance that's based on countries meeting certain conditions, and those are, you know, democratic conditions and a commitment to a certain amount, a certain percentage on arms, particularly for that defensive, to come to the defense of anyone who is under attack. And I think that key to that is recognizing that in in 1995, the deal that was struck with Ukraine was that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. It had an arsenal of about 5,000 nuclear warheads. It gave up those nuclear weapons. And Russia, the US, the UK signed up to protect its territorial integrity and its sovereignty. And that has been breached. It's been breached horrendously. And yes, the West has got some reflection post Georgia, post Crimea, post the Donbass. Of course, there's reflection, and indeed, perhaps Syria. But I do think that we should not buy into this idea that Putin himself has sold, that this is down to expansion of NATO. And it's certainly, in the end, we've got to question why it isn't right that democracies are allowed to determine what alliances they are part of. We here in the United Kingdom, after much debate and much grief, decided to exit the European Union, the alliance we were part of, so we could go our own way. We defended our sovereignty to do that. It's a decision that at the time I disagreed with passionately, as you know, Ben. And I do believe that the people of Ukraine ought to be able to make the same determination as to what alliances that they are part of. I think there's a left tradition that is questioning of imperialism, particularly, but on this occasion, the imperialism that should be challenges in this is imperialism of Putin. The left ought to be very concerned about nationalism, and what we're seeing is a very nasty nationalism. The left ought to be concerned about the financing and the resource and the backup for far-right movements, and we know that there are Russian links to that. The left should be concerned about the undermining of democracies all over the world, in Eastern Europe, of course, but interference in democracies all over the world. And again, Putin has been in that business. Putin is a KGB agent, a former KGB, using all those dirty tricks to get him to this point. And I do think that means that the left has got to speak up vehemently against this.
Thank you. I've got a question for Dalara in Brussels, which is, what should the European Union be doing about the place of Ukraine after the war? Can it join the EU?
Well, I'm in the European Parliament, and when on the day when Zelensky spoke to us in the European Parliament, we also made the clear commitment that we see a European future as part of the European family of Ukraine. And I think this is an important branch we have to also take, because it's about showing also that the European Union is standing with democracies who are defending democracies, and gives this perspective is really, really important. But I think we also have to be very, very honest about how this membership will come to place, because there are criteria. There are criteria based on the democratic status of the rule of law situation, of the economic situation. And I think this is something that we shouldn't speed up, because it's also a responsibility we have to make this partnership a long-term situation. So giving the perspective now and saying we want a European future for those who are fighting for democracy against the Russian aggression, this needs to be the case. And this is a commitment we are doing. But I think we shouldn't go the fast track, because this will destabilize the whole situation more. So I think the perspective is important, but we also have to stick to what is agreed on when it comes to the Copenhagen criteria, as it's called.
So I've got a great question here about Putin's speech the other day, where Putin, in speaking about individuals whose hearts are in the West, but living in Russia, dining on the south of France, appear to be threatening or even throwing the oligarchs under the bus. How should that influence our approach in our anti-oligarch campaigns? To David.
Look, we should always be concerned where effectively goods that were in public hands became private, and that wealth did not find its way to the people of a country. It effectively found its way into the pockets of particular families and particular individuals. We should be very concerned when that wealth is washed either through property, sometimes through super yachts, through fancy homes, whether they're in London or in New York or Tokyo. We should be concerned if that money also finances, and sometimes it does, drugs in our capital cities, often run by inner city kids, or indeed traffics women and children across borders. And, you know, we've also seen, by the way, just in the last 3 weeks, an increase in traffickers trafficking women and children in Eastern Europe. All of it often financed by dirty money. And all of those loopholes should be closed. Loopholes that fund political parties. And we've seen money making its way into the Conservative Party here in the UK. And at the very least, that money should be handed to the Ukraine people and to defending them, not sit in the coffers of a political party. And what we've also seen is, even as the West, even as the UK in this instance, has sought to name and sanction particular individuals, because of the pace, which has been slow to do that, we've seen, for example, Roman Abramovich sailing out of the UK, sailing his yachts out of the UK into easier waters where he can hide his money. There are still individuals not on the list. There are individuals that have been questioned and named by our own security services, and it looks like our Prime Minister have vetoed decisions not to elevate those individuals in society, in this case, into the House of Lords. I'm afraid we've got to get serious about dirty money. We've got to get serious about oligarchs. Russia is the tip of the iceberg. If you look at the challenge to some of our great investigative journalists that have been now on these issues for ages, that many of them facing legal challenge because of the work that they've been doing, you can recognize that this problem is not just unique to Russia. As I said, there are despots in the Middle East. There are despots in some of our, in parts of the Far East. There are despots in some of the African countries, all of whom are hiding their money and washing their money through London and other centres of economic activity. It's got to end. And the left has got to be very vocal, not just on the fact of it ending, but how it ends.
Thank you. I've got a question for Brussels, which is, in Congress, there have been some proposals for emergency measures to rush produce heat pumps, solar panels, and ship them to Europe. Is there any such thinking in Europe itself about what crash decarbonisation could look like in practice?
I also read about it, and of course, I think it's important to cooperate also to make the, for example, European heating systems, which is a basically super fundamental question of the social aspect of how we can do this transition, because heating is the point where at least the vulnerable people are affected most with. Of course, we need to do cooperation with that, but also it's implemented in the Green Deal. We want alternatives being, of course, built also in Europe, but of course we also need to have corporations in that. So there are a big opportunity, and this is why I also think we have to put this in the positive, this transition. We now have to speed up the urgency, or the understanding of the urgency of it. It is more there than ever. And now we have to also talk about the advantages in international cooperation it has, but also at providing jobs within the European Union. So I think this is the narrative we now have to do as progressives to combine our efforts to make us independent from oligarchs' money, to make us independent from fossil fuels. So I think this is exactly the kind of approaches we now have to have, and I'm happy that this is happening also on the other side of the ocean. But of course, this is maybe also something that we can reuse for the whole ambition of hitting the Paris Agreement targets, because what we think I have to also do is to have something like a race to the top when it comes to delivering on the climate goals, and now working together in partnership. So I think it's an important answer. Of course, we like to also import heating pumps, but we also like to develop technologies that make us independent from the fossil fuels.
So another great question coming in here, which I'd like to ask both of you actually, is what are your views on a potential no-fly zone?
Well, I've already indicated that introducing a no-fly zone would breach this important decision that I think that NATO countries have made, not to commit troops and not to play into and escalate this situation into a world war. The minute you have a no-fly zone, you have to enforce that no-fly zone. And by definition, that would mean NATO allies shooting down Russian planes. And if NATO allies shot down Russian planes, as night follows day, you are effectively committing 30 countries to war with Russia. And so I do believe that it's absolutely right that as Jens Stoltenberg has said, we cannot have a no-fly zone. But what we must have, as is the case in all theatres of war, is we must have humanitarian corridors where people wanting to leave can leave without being shelled and bombed and suffering artillery fire, as we've seen as people have tried to exit Mariupol. There may be a greater role for the United Nations in relation to that, but I don't think that we should have NATO enforce no-fly zones.
And the same question to you, Dalara.
I completely agree with what David has said, because I'm not a foreign policy expert, but I'm listening carefully what foreign policy experts are saying about this. And there is no guarantee to all the points you already mentioned, David, that no-fly zones effectively also protect civilian people. This is not something that is something that we have seen in the past, where similar instruments were taken to account. That there is no better protection of civilians with that. So I really much agree that it will be a step in an escalation that we should avoid. It's a direct declaration of war, because we are sending and we are then using military means. So I think this shouldn't happen. But I understand the frustration out of this demands, where it comes from, because we all feel the pressure of what can we do, how can we support the Ukrainian people. But I think we also have to say we are already doing a lot. We are putting up sanctions in a dimension that haven't been there in the history ever. So I think this is something that we have to concentrate on and to also further develop, and also there look where the grounds we can also accelerate the sanctions we are doing. But being an active part in this conflict, and this would a no-fly zone mean, shouldn't be the situation we are choosing. And
I've got a question coming here from one of our fellows, actually, which is, and this is to you, David, which is, how do you think that the Ukraine crisis will be seen historically? Is this the start of a new era in international relations?
Look, I think that we've come out of this horrendous pandemic. And by the way, it may well be that Vladimir Putin has chosen this moment in part because of the pandemic. And my own judgment is that as profound and deep and worrying and alarming as the pandemic has been in terms of the loss of life, and by the way, life continues to be lost in greater numbers in the global south. And of course, much of that is not now being covered because of Ukraine. Despite that, I think that this moment is bigger than the pandemic of the last 2 years. I think that where we are is at least as big as September the 11th, and the focus that came after that on terrorism, the Arab Spring, and the war that flowed from that, two wars that flowed from that. But I have to say, I think that what we're seeing is a huge moment, because it effectively, we're moving from a world in which the United States was the global superpower and the sole superpower to a much more multipolar world in which China is the immense, alongside the United States, power. Russia is this sort of rogue state that doesn't seem to understand soft power, but really understands hard power. And of course, we've got the European Union alongside that, and then huge and very important democracies like India. So if anything, this is a return to a more multipolar world, the sort of world that existed in and around the turn of the last century, and of course, in some ways led to the problems of the First World War. This is the world after the 24th of February is vastly different. I do think that the acceleration that we can now see as a result of the climate emergency will be intense, because of the need now for Europe to end its dependency on Russian oil and gas. I also think that the decision by Germany to increase its military spending will transform the security landscape in Europe over the next decade, and is a major development that many of us didn't think we'd see in our lifetimes. I think that the united front that we've seen from the UN is important, but I do think that we have also seen abstentions on in the end, matters of life and death. And so the positioning of India over this next period, and where China finds itself over this next period, is hugely important. So for all of those reasons, never mind the energy crisis that flows from this, and the challenge I think that working people are going to find with rising inflation, of course, and with rising energy bills, I think is going to have deep consequences for some significant time.
Thank you. Dalara, please.
Yes, because we also need to talk about the structural dimensions of it, and as you mentioned, the raise of money for military spending in Germany. I think it's, of course, it's a very important thing, but I think we also have to have the discussion, and this is what I think progressives should start with, that throwing money at a problem won't be the solution. It's also about more strategic partnership within Europe and more European action when it comes to security question. Right now, we have 27 capitals in Europe who are like managing what is our common line, or who are proposing or developing a security architecture. And this is such a inefficient way of dealing with this. And this is what I think also needs to be the debate we are now having, should have on a structural level. How can we have a common European security architecture? And this is something that I think comes urgent, or more urgent than the question also on spending more, but use the money that is spent in a more efficient way. And this is something also we have, as progressive, have to communicate to people. Why is there the possibility to mobilize money in that dimensions in the case of a war, which is important, but why hasn't it been there in the pandemic? Why there are still the social security systems, the health infrastructure? Why is this in a very worse situation as we saw in the pandemic, and why there is no money from it? So I think we also have to talk about the capacities of public spending and why it's important to guarantee livelihoods and security for all people. And this is what I want to come to the structural debate. It needs to be, and the future of the foreign policy, I wish the European Union and all our allies need to have, is to put people in the center of the discussion and the security of the people, and not only this multilateral chess game we are always seeing. It's about the people who have the right to have to security. And this is, I think, the important structural debate we as progressive have to lead.
So I've got a terrific question from the audience for both of you, really, which is, research has shown time and time again that tax havens are a fundamental part of the problem of oligarchic wealth. Are these not a national security risk? How do we shut them down?
Do you want me to go first? Yes,
yeah.
Is the answer. Look, and I think that there was going to be a new release out of Switzerland. The New York Times, The Guardian, and others were working globally, and it may be that that's been delayed as a consequence of Ukraine. But we were going to find out yet again. We saw this in the Pandora Papers, that there are huge challenges with these tax havens, where wealth is stolen from people and hidden, and where wars, it turns out, are financed, and crime is financed, that causes huge hardship and pain across many of our economies. And time again, in our country, we hear from the government they're going to do something about it. Nothing happens. We've actually had legislation passed. Nothing has happened. And I hope that this crisis demonstrates that we now have to act. I fear that where we see populist right-wing governments, that we will see less act, because I'm afraid they're too close to the dirty money in the first place. And so we won't see the cleaning up of tax havens that we should see. But it cannot be right to continue with this situation where countries like the Cayman Islands, and others continue to service dirty money in this way.
I'd love to ask you the same question, Dalara.
I mean, as progressive, I sometimes I have the feeling that we could just lay back and tell everyone, we have told you, we have to do what we have told you for years now, and even still miss you, my Labour colleagues. Even when our Labour colleagues still were also in the part of the European Parliament, we've been advocating for closing down tax havens, closing down loopholes, closing down shell islands for so long. And the perversion of the situation is that we had it as a kind of competition tool between the different European member states. So designing a tax haven was a competition benefit in a European country for accelerating capital, for accelerating big companies, big tech companies, for example. And this is a perversion we always had been raising as progressives within the European Parliament. And I think this is where we have to now again push for the right things we've demanded for a long time, to close down the tax havens, to make sure that we also have the executives who can track down existing laws. We have laws that we could implement better, but they are not. We don't have the capacities to also look and go for those who are using the loopholes. And I think this is where we have now to put our progressive agenda on the table. And I think very important points already also had been touched by David.
Thank you. So we're running out of time. We've only got 5 minutes left, but I've got one question that's come in from a colleague on the Hill, which is, from London and from Brussels, what would you like us in Congress to be doing? Big question, maybe some specific ideas or declarations. What are you looking for?
I would also like to work on alliances between progressive actors, because I think it's often very, very hard, especially on a parliamentary level, to also connect with US lawmakers. We have a problem with that, and I think this is something that we need to overcome and to really build alliances. Because always when I'm in very amazing think tank events from the US, there's mostly political analysts talking with us. And of course, I know they have a big influence on the decision makers, but we also have to have this bridge being built, a real transatlantic partnership in pushing the progressive agenda, because we saw today, also when Senator Bernie Sanders was there, that we have the same analysis of the problem, and we need to combine our forces to also push for the policies to be made in that sense. So this is what I would have as the biggest wish.
David, I'd like to ask you the same question. What are we looking for?
I do think that Joe Biden's Summit for Democracy is a good initiative. It needs deepening and widening and building on. I think it's very important. I think that, as we saw in the crisis that was the Second World War, Europe needed its important alliance with the United States. And I think, once again, if you look at the sort of support that European countries are going to need to give up their dependency on oil and gas, they are going to need support from the United States. I'm not now just talking about financial support from the United States, but the heft of the United States in persuading other actors globally to be supportive, as there's that phase transition from Russian dependency. And I think that we've got to step up. We haven't talked enough about that today, at how we deal with these cyber attacks and how we put together a proper regulatory framework for what we're seeing with interference in our democracies, with the undermining of social media platforms. That agenda will need to be addressed, and that needs international cooperation. A lot of this needs international cooperation. The last discussion about tax havens will also need international cooperation, and that's where the United States becomes so important.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you, David Lammy MP, UK Shadow Secretary for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs, and Dalara Burkhart, MEP from the European Parliament's Committee on Environmental Matters. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Atlantic Council, and we really hope to welcome you in person when you're next in Washington, DC.
And thank you very much.
Thank you.